If that's okay, I suggest that we should start.
Start.
Ready?
Yeah. Called the dialogical hypothesis, which has it that deduction, deductive reasoning, deductive argumentation have dialogical roots, and I'll explain in a minute, in the many different senses in which I understand roots. But in the main inspiration, the original inspiration for the project for this idea is really historical, right? So it's really taking from the history of logic and the history of philosophy, going back to the ancient Greeks, and thinking about how important these dialogues were for the emergence of logic as we know it, right, in Aristotle and then onwards. So this was really the original inspiration. But then I, of course, went on to develop the dialogical idea also in other ways, not only in a historical sense. And the claim is that, right, so there are these dialogical historical roots in the background, and then these roots, these dialogical roots, are still by and large present in theories as well as practices of deduction, right? So including, for example, mathematical proofs, which I'll talk about quite a bit later, okay? But at the same time, also non-dialogical elements have been picked up along the way in this historical development. So it's not that it's only dialogical, right? So it's a hybrid entity now because deduction has dialogical components as well as non-dialogical components. And the general approach is really to look at logic and mathematics and deduction more generally as as a human activity, as something that is done by humans, and it's embedded in social practices, social cultural practices, rather than in some sort of abstract way, right? As if some Platonic heaven. So it's very much human oriented, right? And thinking about practices of deduction and what these practices mean for different people across the centuries. Okay. So for the book, I adopt, methodologically speaking, I adopt what I call an integrative approach, right? So I draw from different methodologies and I bring them together. And this is something that I've already done in my previous book called the Formal Languages and Logic. Here's the cover. And in that book, in particular, in the conclusion, I describe in quite some detail this idea of an integrative approach. And then the four different methods and perspectives that are that I rely on in the book, both in the previous one and in this one. It's conceptual analysis, kind of more traditional philosophical conceptual analysis, quite a bit of historical investigation. As some of you may know, that I started my career as a historian of logic. So it's still something that I like very much and I think is important. But also engagement with empirical research. So really look at the work done by cognitive scientists, psychologists, mathematics educators, and a bunch of people who look at these at similar questions, but then from an empirical perspective, and also the use of formal methods, right, to investigate certain features of, say, logical systems, right? So these four perspectives, and they are brought together by the dialogical hypothesis, because the dialogical hypothesis translates quite easily into each of these perspectives, right? So it's easy to conceptualize the dialogical hypothesis from these four different approaches. And maybe people will have made the connection already with a book of, not so famous book by Quine. I mean, I think at some point it might have been a bit famous, but I think it's kind of a bit of a neglected classic these days. The book called The Roots of Reference by Quine. And so I read this as an undergraduate way back in Brazil, and somehow I think it always, stayed with me. And then when I was thinking about deduction, and I immediately had to think of roots as a good metaphor to think about the kind of investigation I wanted to undertake. On the other hand, it's what I'm doing is what I did is quite different, a bit different from what Quine did, because Quine was mostly interested in the psychogenesis of reference. These are his terms. And my own understanding of roots is broader. It includes historical roots. As I mentioned, it also includes philosophical roots in the sense of just discussing the conceptual background. Also cognitive roots, in which case it's a bit closer to Quine's own understanding, right? So that's really the motivate. I mean, at least one of the inspirations for this project was this idea of going back to the roots. So this is the structure of the book. Here's the cover of the book, which you may have seen already. So the cover has a piece of a painting by the Dutch painter Vincent van Gogh, also known as Van Gogh, but in Dutch we say Van Gogh. And it's actually the very last painting he painted, right? So then you have trees and roots, right? So that was the thought here. And the book has three parts. The first part is, I call it the philosophy of deduction. Then the second part, the history of deduction. And the third part I look more into deduction in human cognition, deduction in action, as it were. So I don't know, I mean, if the idea is that people ask questions halfway, not really, right? We just do the talk all the way and then questions at the end. Okay. All right, so now, so the three parts, so I'm going to go through all of them, and I'll talk a bit about each chapter. So in the first chapter, which is called The Trouble with Deduction, what I do is, first I introduce what I take to be the three main features of deduction. And these are necessary truth preservation, and it's something that I call belief bracketing, which I'll explain in a minute, and the final one, perspicuity. So necessary truth preservation is not a surprise, that's the one that everybody associates with deduction, and that's what differentiates deduction from other forms of reasoning, like induction or abduction, etc. But then the point is why I'm adding these other two perspectives, these other two aspects, is because if you only look at necessary truth preservation, there's a lot about the practices of deduction that you fail to understand if you only look at necessary truth preservation. And then another one is what I call belief bracketing, is the idea that you should be able to reason from premises, even if you yourself don't believe in these premises, right? So you bracket your own beliefs, the beliefs that you have, and you just reason with the information that is given to you, taking it at face value. And perspicuity is this idea that the argument, the deductive argument, each step of the argument should be clear, convincing, transparent. So these three features are important for us to understand deduction, and they will, be, further developed along the way in the book. And then what I also do in this chapter is argue that there are still puzzles and mysteries about deduction, right? So you might think, why is there still much to say about deduction? Haven't people been talking about deduction for the last 2 millennia? Haven't we solved all the problems? Well, no. Here I mentioned a couple of issues that I think are still very much open issues, and these are where deduction occurs. So is it like everywhere, or is it only in circles of specialists? The question of the nature of deductive necessity, and also what deduction does for us. What are the functions of deduction? So I claim that all these questions have not been properly answered in the literature, and they need further investigation. In chapter 2, it's called Back to the Roots of Deduction. That's kind of a methodological chapter where I talk about this idea of why go back to the roots, and what the different ways in which roots can be understood. So also, historically, but also at different time scales, right? You can think about the phylogeny of deduction, right? So it's the history of deduction in terms of the species, as it were. You can think about the history of deduction just in terms of the historical cultural development. And you can also think about the ontogeny of deduction, which is the development of deductive skills in a particular individual. So all these different roots, I talk about them right? So I kind of tease them apart. And then I say that I kind of describe the main hypothesis and how it translates into 4 different approaches, right? So philosophical approach, a historical approach, cognitive approach, and also related to mathematical practices. Okay, so this is kind of basically just, preparing the terrain for the rest of the book to progress. The chapter 3 is really where the action starts, and in a way it's the most important chapter of the book, because that's really where the model, the Proof of Skeptic model, is introduced. And I do this by discussing other dialogical conceptions of logic that are available in the literature, in particular Lawrenson's dialogical logic and Hintica's game theoretical semantics. But also I talk about Lakatos and the idea of proofs and refutations as a model for mathematical practice. And I borrow to some extent from all of them, more from Lakatos than from the others. But what I'll do ultimately is still something different from what each of them has done. And so on the basis of these discussions, I then introduced the Proof of Skeptic games, right? This model where the dialogue in question involves 2 fictive participants, prover and skeptic, and how that's really the model that these 2 participants play a particular dialogical game with certain rules, which I'll explain in a minute. And that's really the model, the rational reconstruction of what a deductive argument, deductive reasoning is. And in this chapter, I also talk about the interplay between cooperation and adversariality in these games. So these games are by and large cooperative, right? So people like Lawrenson and Hintica had emphasized the adversarial component of these games, right? That's why they were using game theoretical terms like winning strategy to talk about dialogical, like these logical dialogues. And I think they really failed to appreciate how much cooperation is really involved. So by and large, they're cooperating, right? These 2 participants. But there's a certain amount of adversariality still involved. And so these dialogues, let me spend some time talking about them a little bit, because they're really important. So these dialogues, that they're the rational reconstruction of deductive arguments. So I'm not claiming that this is how things exactly take place, although later in the book I say that mathematical practices of mathematical proofs work very much along the lines of these dialogues, the dialogues as like the Proof of Skeptic dialogues. But so anyway, so the dialogue starts with prover usually asserting the proposition to be proved, and then asking skeptic to grant certain premises. And then from these premises that have been granted, then prover proceeds in a stepwise way by moving from certain premises to a conclusion that can be drawn from these premises, and then to another conclusion from there, and so on. And this is what prover does, and then moving towards the conclusion again, right, which has been stated at the beginning. Skeptic, in turn, has a couple of things that he can do. One of them is coming up with counterexamples, and the counterexample can be global, right, to the whole proof, or it can be local to a particular inferential step. But skeptic can also ask for further clarification. So if a particular step is not clear enough, skeptic can say, "But why? Why are you saying this? Like, what's going on here? This is going too quick for me. Please explain." And also, skeptic can deny or grant premises, right? And perhaps you notice already that these 3 moves are related to exactly the 3 main components of deductive reasoning, as I described in the beginning. Necessary truth preservation is related to kind of the coming up with counterexamples. Asking for further clarifications has to do with perspicuity, and granting or denying premises has to do with belief bracketing. Okay. And again, I'm repeating something I've already said. So some amount of adversariality against a largely cooperative background is really the nature of these dialogues. And I can talk about this if people want. It has to do with alignment of interests, which is not even stuff that I have in the book. It's something that I developed after. So, but I can talk about it if people want to know more about it. All right. So here's a tree for these dialogues. It's quite small. I don't. You probably can't see the details here, but right, just to illustrate like how these games progress, proceed, and the different choices at each step. So, right, so first the thesis is stated by prover, and then prover asks skeptic to grant premises. At this point, skeptic can already say, no, I'm not going to grant the premises. I'm not interested in having the conversation with you. And that's game over, right? Another way in which it's game over right at the beginning is if there's immediately a counterexample, right? So that's from the thesis that has been stated and the premises that have been asked, skeptic can already show that there is a situation where the premises are the case and the conclusion is not. That is already a counterexample. But assuming that skeptic grants the premises, then the game starts, and then there's the first inferential step proposed by prover. And then here, if skeptic is completely happy with that inferential move, then he does nothing, right? So it's the null move. He just kind of nods in agreement. But if not, then he can ask a why question, right? Say why, but why, why I don't quite get why, how this step is valid. And then in response to that, prover has to perhaps break down this particular inferential step into two smaller, simpler steps. And if a skeptic comes up with a counterexample here, right, local one only to this inferential step, then prover has to withdraw this particular step or modify it, and and then find some other way to move towards the conclusion. And if all goes well, eventually, prover gets to the conclusion, and skeptic has agreed to all the steps along the way leading to the conclusion. And or else, if not, then maybe prover will give up on the proof, right? We'll realize, well, this is not working, right? And then still the dialogue has been fruitful, because then prover realized that something that because I use she for prover and he for skeptic, there's something that she thought would be a promising strategy for a proof turns out not to be. So that's the model. And then for the rest, the rest of the book, I'm developing, this model in different directions. So, so in chapter 4, it's still a philosophical chapter. Deduction as a dialogical notion. I go back to these, to the three features of deduction that I mentioned at the very beginning, and then I interpret them from a dialogical perspective. So what you have is necessary truth preservation becomes this idea of indefeasibility, that you're presenting an argument that is watertight, that's not going to be defeated, right? That there's not going to be an objection that skeptic can raise. And this in other models, there's also the idea of a winning strategy. But because I'm not presupposing that these games are zero-sum games, then I can't really use the notion of a winning strategy as Lawrence and Hintiga do. The belief bracketing part I understand as a perspective shift, right? It's when you're drawing conclusions from the commitments that somebody else has expressed, not necessarily your own, right? So what we do, like for the sake of the argument, let's assume this and see what follows from that. Or else, for example, in a court of law, when one of the, say the defense has made certain statements and then the prosecution draws some conclusions from these statements and shows that they lead to something absurd, and so probably they don't stand, right? They're not plausible. And perspicuity is the cooperative component, right? It's really the part where where you see that these dialogues are not just intended for prover to crush skeptic or force skeptic to grant the conclusion no matter what. No, they're really meant also to enlighten skeptic, right? To increase skeptics' understanding of what's going on, right? So I talk about explanatory persuasion as the function of proofs, of deductive proofs. Not just persuasion, but also explanatory persuasion. And there's, of course, a literature on the explanatoriness of mathematical proofs. I've also written on that, so that fits with this idea. And then in the rest of the chapter, I look at 4 open questions in the literature and philosophy of logic that have been discussed quite a bit in the last decades. And I just kind of, twist them a bit, give them a dialogical twist. I show how new light can be shed on these questions if we adopt the dialogical perspective. And these issues that I discuss are logical consequence, which is something that Mário Gomes Torrente has also worked on quite a bit. In fact, that's how I met him once at a workshop on the topic. Anyway, the normativity of logic, which is something that's also been discussed a lot in the literature in the last decades. Paradoxes and structural rules, also a hot topic. And logical pluralism. So these are all hot topics in philosophy of logic, and my claim is here that if you adopt this dialogical perspective, you really see things differently, and a lot of the puzzles are, at least to some extent, dissolved. Okay, so now we move to the historical part. So I don't know to what extent people have, the audience here has particular interest in the history of philosophy. Yes, okay. I see some people say yes. So good. So I really enjoyed writing these chapters. In fact, I was, especially chapter 5. This was the last part that I wrote, and I was quite worried, because that required doing proper scholarly work and going back to reading all these sources. So it was quite a lot of work, but I'm quite happy with how it turned out. So I talk about them with pleasure. So chapter 5 is about deduction in mathematics and dialectic in ancient Greece. And so when things started historically. And here first I briefly present the method of conceptual genealogy, which is something that I've been already using also in my previous work. And I also have a number of papers where I talk about specifically this method. Here is a bit, in the book, it's a short version of the story. But it's really the method that I use in my historical investigations, and it's the idea that you look along. It's longue durée history, right? So I like to look at developments over long periods of time, and I like to look at the transformations along the way. So I'm interested in what stays the same and what changes, and also it also emphasizes very much the aspect of practices that are connected also to. It's not just theoretical, right? It's also related to practices and to broader contexts. So that's why I look at the social political background of Athenian democracy as, and many people have said this before, I'm obviously not the first one to say it. It's really the historical background for the emergence of logic as we know it, deductive logic as we know it. Spend quite some time on that. Then I look at deduction and mathematics, mostly rely on the work of Vrije, who I'm going to talk about in a minute. And then I also talk about deduction and dialectic, right, and say what you see in Plato's dialogues, and the notion of refutation, or in Greek known as the elenchus, and because all this is important to understand how deduction emerges then with Aristotle. And so I spent quite some time talking about dialectic here. And then in before I move to chapter 6. So this is from a book, this is Vrije, and he has this book, he published this book more than 20 years ago called The Shaping of Deduction, which is still the most comprehensive account of the historical emergence of deduction in Greek mathematics, ancient Greek mathematics. And in the book, he says the following at some point in the book, and this quote really summarizes the gist of the project of my book very much. So Greek mathematics reflects the importance of persuasion. It reflects the role of orality in the use of formulae, in the structure of proofs, but this orality is regimented into a written form where vocabulary is limited, presentation follows a relatively rigid pattern. It is at once oral and written. So what's really interesting is that this transformation took place already at that time in ancient Greece. It's something that starts as an oral practice. And the example I give in the book is from the Meno, the Platonic dialogue, the Meno, when Socrates is showing the slave boy how to double the area, the square of the square. And so it starts very orally, but already at this early stage, techniques of writing already become incorporated in these practices. For example, already the use of letters to designate points in a diagram, as you see, for example, in the Elements by Euclid. So all this is already, early on, there's already this combination, this mix of oral elements with written elements. Okay, so then I moved to chapter 6, and in chapter 6, I spent quite some time discussing Aristotle and syllogistic, and then and more briefly, I talk about logic and argumentation in classical India and also in classical China. So what I claim there is that Aristotle's syllogistic originates from concerns pertaining to dialectic, right? So really to address how to argue well in dialectical encounters. But syllogistic also draws significantly from mathematics. So you really need both, right? So there's a bit of a discussion in the literature. So Robin Smith, for example, claims that syllogistic really is a theory of mathematics. It's a mathematical theory. It's not about dialectic. Other people say it's about dialectic and not about mathematics. I'm saying it's both. It's a false dichotomy, right? It's a false dilemma. So, and I talk about this combination in the chapter. And I spent quite some time talking about what Aristotle describes as arguments leading to the impossible. And that is what we understand as reduction ad absurdum arguments, right? So arguments where you start somewhere and then you go from there to something impossible, something absurd, and that makes you backtrack, and then you reject the initial assumption, right? And these arguments are extremely, extremely important in the prior analytics. And these arguments, and really, you really see how important they were for the development of deduction as we know it now. And they are also already widely present in mathematics of the time, say with Euclid and all that. And then for China and India, what I argue is that also in those traditions, logic was very closely related to dialogical debating practices. So in a sense, it's an interesting, what you see is kind of like a similar development, a convergence, right? Between, say, there's the Greek tradition where I claim these dialogical practices were very important for the development of logical theories. And you see something very similar in these other traditions, even though their starting points are very different. So for example, in India, the philosophical discussions were not so much about ethics and politics as they were in the Greek case. They were mostly about metaphysics and epistemology. So they were, at a higher level of abstraction, as it were, in the Indian tradition. And yet that also led to the development of logical theories. Okay, moving on. Then in chapter 7, it's still a historical chapter. I then pick up so I continue the historical longue durée perspective. But so I start then at the beginning of the Latin tradition with Boethius. So that means I skipped the whole tradition of late antiquity, which is a very important lacuna, and it's too bad, right? But I just didn't have the time anymore and the space and the expertise. So that's something that will be for another life, I guess. But anyway, so just being honest here and say that I don't have much on the Stoics, for example. And now, by the way, I don't know if you've seen, people who spend time on the internet will have seen that Suzanne Bobsien recently announced that she has this paper where she basically claims that Frege drew almost everything that was innovative in his system from the Stoics, or at least from a particular presentation of Stoic logic that was available at the time. So anyway, the Stoics are important, is all I want to say. But I don't talk about them in the book. So I start with the Latin tradition, and I spend quite some time talking about the etymology of the very term deduction, right, which is, of course, a Latin term. And it turns out that the etymology is directly related to these arguments leading to the impossible that I just mentioned. Right? So the Aristotelian arguments whereby you start with some assumption and then you end up somewhere absurd, and then you reject the initial assumption. And that's really because that's really how the word deductio came about. So I can talk more about this if people are interested in Q&A. And then after that, I talk about two Aristotelian logical traditions in the Middle Ages, the Latin tradition, which is the one where I used to work on, and so I know more about that. But I also talk about the Arabic tradition and their sister traditions, because they both start with Aristotle, but then they split. And in the Latin tradition, the dialogical component stayed more prominent than in the Arabic tradition. And then after that, I talk about why we forgot the dialogical origins of logic, by and large, right? So why these days, if you just look at a dictionary, or if you look at a textbook, it's going to say that logic has to do with the conditions of thought for thought as such, with the laws for thinking and all this, and it doesn't talk about dialogues much at all. And in this part, I explain how this happened, and that has to do with the prominence of mentalistic conceptions of logic in the early modern period, and then of course later we had the mathematical turn in logic in the 19th century. So that kind of made us forget about the dialogical origins of deduction, even though there are still these dialogical elements that are there, even if they're not acknowledged as such. So that's really what I was trying to do in this book, is try to unearth these dialogical elements that are there but are not acknowledged as such. Right, so then the third part of the book is the more kind of empirically oriented part of the book. Chapter 8 starts with a kind of overview of findings from the psychology of reasoning with respect to deductive reasoning. So probably many of you are already familiar with this literature, right, which shows that people are really bad at deductive reasoning with experiments in the lab. This is a tradition that's been ongoing since the 60s, right? It started with Peter Wazen, famous for the Wazen selection task. So I've gone through these results. I had already talked quite a bit about this tradition in my previous book, and here I just look at what happened since I had published that book. So, right, to update a bit the state of affairs in terms of deductive reasoning from an empirical perspective. And by and large, it just, people are not, don't naturally, spontaneously engage in deductive reasoning. But the interesting thing is that if you put people in groups and let them discuss when having to solve deductive tasks, then performance improves significantly. People are much better at reasoning deductively if they're given the chance to discuss with people. And that, I think, is already, of course, a partial vindication of my whole story, of my whole dialogical story. But of course, I'm not going to stop there, right? I need to go further, because then you want to understand why talking with others, has this facilitating effect. And then chapter 9 is the ontogeny of deductive reasoning. So here I'm interested in how a particular person can learn how to reason deductively, right? So while on the one hand, people don't spontaneously reason deductively, that's what these results from the last decades in the psychology of reasoning have shown. But people can learn how to reason deductively given a certain kind of training. And so here, in this chapter, I address this very question. And the general claim is that a dialogical scaffolding facilitates the learning process of deductive reasoning. It's easier to learn to be a good deductive reasoner if you think about it in dialogical terms. And here I review results in the literature showing, for example, that if you present the dialogue as being adversarial, then people understand much better the idea of necessary truth preservation. The idea that there cannot be that given the model of the premises, the conclusion has to be true in all of them, not only in some of them. Belief bracketing is really this idea of projecting into somebody else, right? So say, well, here are these premises, and then you can say, well, but I don't believe that. Oh, no, but it doesn't matter. Assume that there's somebody else who believes these premises. What would this person also, what would the conclusions be that this person would draw? And perspicuity as really, if you think about proofs as something that has this explanatory, say mathematical proofs or other deductive arguments, as meant to really be discourse aimed at other people, right? So it's really about explaining something to other people. That also helps very much. And then in this chapter, I also talk about the notion of internalization, which is very important to understand why deductive arguments, they don't really look like dialogues on a superficial examination, because one of the participants, skeptic, has been internalized by the method itself. And the notion of internalization actually was introduced. I mean, there are different ones, but the one I'm relying on quite a bit was introduced by the Soviet psychologist Lev Vygotsky. So it's something that's much broader in his framework, but I use specifically to talk about how these practices, right? You first learn these practices, these dialogical practices in real life, by really arguing with an actual skeptic. And after that, you can enact these dialogues, as it were, with yourself by internalizing skeptic. Okay? So I spent quite some time on that in this chapter. We then move to chapter 10, which is a more speculative chapter. Right, so because here I'm talking about the phylogeny of deductive reasoning, and whenever you're talking about phylogeny, right, you're talking about very long time scales, and that means that it's much harder to have relevant data evidence, right, that lets you draw conclusions. But still, I tried my best here, and what I do in this chapter, first I look at traces of deductive reasoning in non-human animals. So you may be familiar with, like, for example, the dog, right, or the Chrysippus dog, which allegedly, could do disjunctive syllogism, right? There's A or B or C. If it's not A, if it's not B, then it must be C, right? So then there's this famous anecdote. And so, but then if you really look at the actual evidence, it seems that, the deductive reasoning in non-human animals is very rudimentary, and in fact can be explained also by using different models of cognition, right? So if they're doing, say, associative learning, they would still do things that might look on the test as if they're doing deductive reasoning, but there are other explanations for that too, with simpler cognitive mechanisms. And then I talk about the evolution of reasoning in general, right? So not evolution of deductive reasoning. And here I talk about Mercier and Sperber, who have been developing this very influential view that reasoning is about what they call the interactionist view, right? It's reasoning is about engaging in dialogues with others. So there's a lot that they and I agree on, but there's also some disagreement, in particular because they think that reasoning is an adaptation, it's a genetic adaptation. And I don't agree with that. I think it's a cultural phenomenon, right? It emerges as a product of cultural evolution for humans. And to argue for this view, I rely on a framework which was developed by the cognitive scientist Cecilia Hayes, which she calls cognitive gadgets, right? So she has this, there was also a book she published a few years ago, and where she shows that with a very, very, what she calls a minimal starter kit, right? With very few components, cognitive components, you can show that a lot of very sophisticated cognitive behaviors can emerge without you having to postulate that they correspond to modules that have some sort of counterpart in genetic evolution, right? So it's a story of cultural evolution there. And then finally, I look at the deduction in the brain. There's some research on that too. And what this research shows actually is that there's no such thing as deduction in the brain in a localized sense, right? Deduction is many things in the brain because, right, it's a very diffuse process which activates different brain areas, which seems to suggest that deduction is not like this one. Of course, even though a module doesn't need to correspond to a particular brain area, but typically people often hypothesize that there will be a connection of a localization. Well, in this case, then what you see is that there's not one place where deduction happens in the brain. So, okay, so now moving to the final chapter, the one on mathematics, and it's really, it might be my favorite chapter of the book. So I make people, saving the best for last, I make people read the whole book, and then at the very end, finally, then you see that deduction really happens in real life too, right? Because until that, now I could have been talking about air. I could have been talking about unicorns, right? Things that don't really exist. But this final chapter shows that deduction is alive and kicking in mathematical practices, and that my model does a really good job, obviously, at explaining, a number of features of mathematical practice. So here's the chapter is called The Dialogical Account of Proofs in Mathematical Practice. And what I claim is that Skeptic, who are in the original story fictive characters, are actually alive and kicking in the form of mathematicians who then write proofs and send them to journals, and the skeptic is the referee. So referee plays the role of skeptic. And it's amazing how, the actual practices of referees really really match perfectly with my description of how the moves that are available to skeptic. And I'll give an example of that in a minute. And in this chapter, I discuss a number of case studies. I talk about Gödel's, the reception of Gödel's incompleteness proofs in the 1930s. I talk about Waal's proof of Hermesless Theorem, which I'll talk about more in a minute. I talked about a failed proof of the inconsistency of piano arithmetic in 2011, I think. And very, very quickly, so this guy announced that he had this proof of inconsistency of PA, and very quickly people found mistakes in the internet, and it was within a week it was all solved. It's a very interesting case study for the prover-skeptic interaction. And then also the ongoing saga of the ABC conjecture, right? So there's this mathematician in Japan, Mochizuki, who claims to have a proof of the ABC conjecture, but the proof is too difficult, so the community hasn't really accepted the proof yet, but people also, it's not obvious what would be wrong with the proof. The most recent developments is that two mathematicians from Germany think they found a mistake in the proof, and they went to talk to the guy in Japan, and then he doesn't think that these are mistakes. So, the stalemate is still there, right? So it's still unclear, what will happen here. And I also talk about different functions of proofs in mathematics. So I, of course, focused in adopting this dialogical perspective. I was very much focusing on the function of persuasion and explanation, but proofs have other functions in mathematics too. They also have the function of unification, of innovation, of introducing new concepts. That's something that Lakatos was very keen on emphasizing. So I don't want my story to be a kind of monolithical story where I say that there's only one function for proof. But I think there are many different functions for proofs in mathematics, even if I still think that adopting this dialogical perspective and so emphasizing persuasion and explanation has a lot of explanatory power. And in this chapter, I also briefly talk about proofs that don't really fit the prover-skeptic model, like computational proofs and probabilistic proofs. If people want to talk about this, we can talk about this at Q&A. And I just want to, I'm almost finishing now. So here's the story about Waal's proof of Hermesless Theorem. Perhaps some of you are already familiar with how it went, but if not, so let me just give you a brief background. Right? So Waal's claimed that he had this proof of Hermesless Theorem, which is something that people have been working on for centuries. So that was a really big deal. And then this proof was sent to a journal, and the editor broke down the proof into 6 parts and sent each of them to a particular referee. Okay? And then the referees were working through the details of the proof. And the interesting thing is that in mathematics, refereeing is often not anonymous. So it's the referee typically always knows the identity of the author, which is a bit weird for us, I guess, as philosophers, right? So it's not how we do it. And sometimes even it goes the other way around. And in this particular case, the refereeing process had become an actual dialogue between the referees and the prover, right? So and Wiles. So it's 2 people, like Katz and another guy, Illusi. They were assigned a particular part of the proof to go through. And now this comes from a journalistic piece on this story, right? So these are not my words. For 2 months, Katz and a French colleague, Luc Illusi, scrutinized every logical step in Katz's section of the proof. From time to time, they would come across a line of reasoning they couldn't follow. Katz would email Wiles, who would provide a fix. Right, so this is very much the skeptic asking a why question, but why, does this work? How does this follow? Right. So then he proved that, but then Wells every time could just explain and right and fix things. But in late August, Wells offered an explanation that didn't satisfy the two reviewers. And when Wells took a closer look, he saw that Katz had found a crack in the mathematical scaffold. At first, a repair seemed forward, but as Wells picked at the crack, pieces of the structure began falling away. So, and then for those of you who remember, right, so it took Wells another full year to fix the proof. And in fact, then he worked in collaboration with Richard Taylor. And until then, he had worked by himself. Right? So this really is the prover-skeptic interplay in action, and which led to a significant improvement of the result, right? Because a mistake was found and then later fixed. And then finally, this proof became available, which is still now accepted as valid in the mathematical community. But it's also a proof that's very long and complicated. So people still try to prove Hermesless theorem in different ways. They want better proofs, proofs that will be shorter, will be simpler, would be purity of a proof is when the proof doesn't use concepts that are not part of the statement of the theorem, right? So and Wells's proof is very impure because Fermat's theorem is a statement about numbers. It's a very, just a statement that people like in high school can understand. And yet Wells has to use very complicated machinery and very different abstract concepts for the proof to go through. So it's not it's impure. But anyway, so the people are still working on this, but the proof as it stands is seen as valid, legitimate. And so Fermat's theorem is now still recognized as true. All right, so that's my final slide, my conclusions. Right, so I said deduction is at once oral and written. This is a slogan which I bore from Ravionet's, which really summarizes the book as a whole. I claim in the book that deduction has dialogical roots, which are still largely present both in theories and in practice of deduction, but also that there are quite a number of non-dialogical features in these practices. And the dialogical hypotheses allow for the unification of these different approaches and perspectives, right? So remember that I had these four methods that I wanted to use, these four perspectives, and the dialogical hypothesis lends itself well for all four of them to be pursued. And then I claim that, right, so I mean, the overall structure of the book is really as an abductive argument, right, or an argument to the best explanation. So I really need all these different elements, right? So each of the arguments that I offer by themselves may not be enough to convince people to think about deduction in a dialogical way, but taken all together, that's why we needed a whole book to present them all. Taken all together, I claim that then the case becomes quite strong that the best way to understand deduction in its different manifestations is by taking seriously its dialogical roots and its still ongoing dialogical nature. And then again, going back to the point I made at the beginning, I hope now it's clear what I meant by that at the beginning, right? That I really am interested in the human and social nature of deduction, right? I'm interested in deduction as something that people do, right? As embedded in actual practices of, people in different domains. Of course, I claim in the book that for the most part, it's something that's restricted to the circles of specialists, but still, it's something that people do, and that's what I wanted to highlight in the book. So that's my final slide, and here's I had the final one with the cover again. So just let me give you the cover for a minute, and then that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. People,
thanks.
I see people clapping. So please, if you go to participants, you find the button where you can raise your hand. And
so I'm gonna stop sharing the screen, okay, so that we can see each other better.
Do you want to make a short pause, or do we move directly to the Q&A?
I would, if it's okay, I would just want to get something to eat because it's kind of getting late. I'm a bit hungry, so I'll just 2 minutes. I'll just get something
Okay,
to eat.
we just make a short pause of 2 minutes where people are raising their hands and we come back.
Okay.
Perfect. Santiago, ¿levantas la mano?
Sí. Sino que no tengo un manito, entonces no puedo.
Ah, vale, te añado nota. Perfecto. Let's go to the gallery view. La primera mano que tenía era de Raimundo Morado, que aprovecho para preguntarle dónde está virtualmente.
En la Ciudad de México,
No veo.
en Coyoacán.
Ah, no, el fondo es Coyoacán.
Ah, no, el fondo es, lo reconocerá seguramente Axel Barceló. Es en honor a él. Así es, la Universidad de Indiana, donde Axel estudió su doctorado.
Y esta era nuestra porra, era así, Go I U, porque es una I y una U. ¿Pero qué? ¿Es el auditorio o es la Lilly Library? ¿Es el auditorio?
El auditorio. La biblioteca está a la derecha.
Ahí vi a Fiona Apple.
Muy bien. Gracias. Catarina, ready?
Yes, ready.
And Raimundo, please.
Muchas gracias, Catarina. Es un libro fascinante el que nos has entregado, siguiendo la línea de tus investigaciones previas. ¿Podrías hablarnos un poquito más sobre la relación entre la deducción, las raíces dialógicas de la... Sorry, should I be speaking in English?
Tap to Catarina.
Yo comprendo, puedo comprender, pero no puedo contestar en español.
Okay, I'll phrase it in English to keep
Okay, up to
one
you.
language. If you could say a little more about the relation between the dialogical roots of deduction vis-a-vis the dialogical roots of deductive argumentation. Because you bring in some psychological aspects like perspicuity, which in one of your chapters you actually cash out in terms of the clarity of when you're talking with somebody else. There's a passage when, let me see, you mentioned that it is indeed a psychological notion, and we might want to have this distinction between the need for these elements when we are arguing, and we are just demonstrated in a very abstract way, very ideal and realistic way, but conceptually different. So can you talk about the difference between those notions? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, so that's why also I mentioned Vygotsky, right, the psychologist Vygotsky, because there's a whole theory behind this. I actually think that, can you hear me well, by the way? Yes, right? Yeah. I think that this is, I mean, on the one hand, I agree with you. It's useful to distinguish conceptually, right? One thing is just to, what you do, say, in a social public realm, right, when you're talking to other people. Something else is what happens, say, mental, psychological processes. But the point is that, so the Vygotskian hypothesis is that ontogenetically, in terms of how you come to develop mental capacities for reasoning, this is anchored in first learning how to engage in these practices with others. Right, so the social comes first. The social and the public comes first, and that's exactly what gives you the tools you need to then develop capacities of reasoning when you're not in a social situation, right? So again, conceptually, I'm happy to draw this distinction, but I do think that developmentally, and I'm here following Vygotsky and others, the social comes first, and then the individual, right? Whereas many people, of course, there are many other models of cognition that really think, well, first there's some sort of individual development, and then you develop tools which then allow you to engage in social processes. My story is the other way around. I think first you really develop cognitive skills by engaging in social interactions, and then these cognitive skills can later be deployed also when you're on your own reasoning. So I hope this addresses your worry. Is that enough, or would you like to hear more?
Sorry, are we talking right now only about humans or any possible epistemic agent?
No, humans, right? I mean, because that's really a story about the development of human cognition. And so if you're interested in other animals, right? So there is the work of Peter Godfrey Smith on octopuses, right? On the cognition of octopuses. And it's really, really interesting because they're very cognitively very developed, but they're not social animals. So it's really an example of animals that have developed high cognitive capacities, apparently, but not for social use, okay? Whereas humans specifically, because we are social animals, hypersocial animals even, right? For us, in our story, in our development, this is something that's very much related to these social practices, right? But it could definitely be, there could be, and in fact, maybe if Peter Godfrey Smith is right, there are beings, animals that have developed, highly developed cognitive apparatuses that were not motivated by sociality needs. So I don't know if that helps or makes it more complicated, but at least I was fascinated when I read the book about the octopuses. I don't know if some other people have read it too, yeah. Right? That to see that, there are other motivations to be smart that are not related to sociality considerations for other species, but not for us.
Thank you. Axel Barceló.
Muchas gracias. Thank you so much for the talk. And I understand that this is just a very abridged version of a very long work. So maybe while I'll ask you haven't read the book, and I'm sorry, I haven't read the book.
No, no problem. That's what I'm here for.
Okay, cool. So it's a key part of your project that this is about the dialogical origins of deduction and not any other kind of inference, right? So but that is the part where I am less convinced, because a lot of the things you say about deduction can just be applied to any other deductive reasoning. So one of the key elements is this indivisibility, right? That's why the first element you mentioned is this necessary truth preservation that has to do with dealing with counterexamples. But I don't see it. I'm sorry. I don't see why we would why a notion as strong as indivisibility would be kind of a natural consequence of the dialogical conception of debates and information pooling, etc. Because this is too strong, right? Even in your kind of flow chart, given that we always have limited resources, it seems that we don't need anything as strong as indivisibility. You just need to be able to keep track to what counterexamples have been offered, what the claims have been offered. So that is my question. My question is.
So no, I mean, it's a very, very interesting question. So I don't claim that whenever there are certain dialogical practices, naturally, necessarily something like necessary truth preservation will emerge. In fact, that's why I also talk about the Chinese tradition, where there were very sophisticated, interesting dialogical debating practices, but we don't get something like deductive reasoning emerging. You need other things, okay? So that's why, I mean, and I think actually in the Indian case, it also happens, but later, okay? Not in ancient India, so a bit later. But in the Greek case, it's not just dialogical practice. They're very specific dialogical practices, right? Which then made the idea of an argument that is like there are no possible counterexamples to them. That became such an interesting, salient feature. And then I really place it in a background, in a cultural, social, historical background, right? So one of them is, for example, the fact, right? So there was the model the rhetorical mode of the sophists, right? Which is the one typically associated with Athenian democracy. And then what happened, as you may remember, right, there were the Peloponnesian Wars, and Athens was crushed by Sparta and right, and the allies of Sparta, and that really made people, including Plato, question democracy as a model, political model, and also question the style of discourse that was associated with that political system, democracy. And so they said, no, we don't want this discourse that is not aimed at truth. We want discourse, that really gives you a higher level of certainty, right? And so then you really need to look at it's all very, very contingent, right? So there's nothing automatic happening there, right? It's quite contingent. And there were like just these factors, and it might just also just be a fluke, it's just that, but it's not entirely a fluke, because you see this happening both in mathematics and in philosophy, although of course, again, Aristotle was also very much inspired by mathematics. So anyway, just to say that, I'm with you. There's no automaticity here at all. It's much more contingent than that.
Thank you. Can I have a follow-up pretty fast? But then, why did it survive? Given the contingency of something as strong for this very particular, how did it spread through the West?
Yes, because this is the interesting thing, right? Because sometimes something, actually, you could even think about it, on a biological analogy, right? For a new organism, let's use the COVID example, right? That it emerged in a sense, it's a fluke, right? It's random, but then it spreads because it's successful, okay? So I think that deduction, Greek mathematics, as as we know it, Euclidean Greek mathematics, right? So, and then of course there is it became extremely influential, right? And the other thing is, of course, if you look at the logic side or the philosophy side, Aristotle had this, overarching influence. So it can also just, might be a fluke of historical contingencies that these particular traditions and these particular people became influential. But I actually don't really think that this is the whole story. I do think that there's something really powerful about deduction. Right? So it's not like, that's why I bothered writing a whole book about it. It's not that I think it's just like one, and one form of reasoning just like all the others. And that's also why I'm not a social constructivist all the way. I don't think that deduction is as good as any other reasoning method, right? I think there's something really cool about it. And I, argue for this like in different ways. One of them is, for example, that it helps you counter certain cognitive biases that we have, right? And it's also something that I argued in my other book. So one of the usual story is that it gives you more certainty, right? But as you said yourself, often this certainty is overkill. We don't need that much certainty, right? For most intents and purposes. But if you're doing, for example, if you're in a scientific context, a really cool thing about deduction is that it really forces you, right, to look at all the models of the premises, not only your preferred ones. Right, and that really makes you, keep your own beliefs a bit in check, right? So I do think that there are reasons why it's such an interesting development that are not totally arbitrary. But the emergence itself is something that happened, I think, very much related to particular historical cultural context, and then it just caught on, as it were.
Thank you so much. That was very, very helpful.
Thanks.
Thank you. Santiago Echeverri, please.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. My question is about the function of belief bracketing in deductive reasoning. One of the reasons you gave for that condition is that it enables us to project ourselves into someone else's epistemic perspective. And my question is about whether belief bracketing is the only way of achieving that goal, or whether there are some cases of deductive reasoning where you just need to find agreement on some premises that you and your interlocutor both believe, for instance.
Yeah, no,
so,
for many, sorry, go on.
So there will be many cases in which it might be good, not reductio ad absurdum, but other cases of reasoning where you what you want is to identify a common ground, and the common ground is, let's say, share beliefs or share acceptances or whatever, but doxastic states of that case. So that's the first part of my question. And the second part is, what would belief bracketing be? So is it entertaining a proposition, or supposing that P is the case, or is it suspending judgment on P? So I think those are different ways of cashing out belief bracketing, and I'm not sure which one would be the one at work. Yeah.
So I think actually it goes the other way around. It's not that you do belief bracketing so that you can reason from what somebody else believes. It's the other way around, because we often have in our social practices, we often have to reason assuming, what somebody else is thinking, right? Because you're trying to understand what they're doing, or you try to anticipate what their next step is going to be, and then you kind of like try to put yourself in their position. So the story is actually, in that sense, in terms of function, is the other way around. First, we develop this ability, right, to try to imagine what other people put ourselves in their position. But actually, what empirical research shows is that this is super hard. We're really bad at that, right? It's known as the egocentric bias. So this is even if you get training for that, it's still really bad. It's still really hard. Another thing that empirical research has shown is that it's very hard for people to reason on the basis of premises that they don't really endorse, right? So even in simple cases with syllogisms, even when they're told, they say, forget about the content, the plausibility, just look at the logical connection. Still, very often they're going to say that an argument is valid because it has a plausible conclusion, right? So this is cognitively something that's very hard to do. So, but my point is not so much that belief bracketing should always happen in deduction, but for you to be a fully skilled deductive reasoner, you have to be able to do that. And then, of course, when there will be cases where this is not necessary, like you're describing, right? Then it's totally fine. And then these are the special cases where it's okay that we actually believe in, two interlocutors actually share a belief in a particular set of premises, and then reason from that, right? But it's more general, I find, not to require this, and then allow for special cases where this can happen. Okay, so that was the thought. And right, and just because in logic and in mathematics, it's all about connections, right? So I mean, not all about, but to a great extent, also mathematics, right? So there are a lot of mathematical proofs that are, if this is, it's like they're conditional proofs. If this is true, then this other thing is true, right? So for example, the ABC conjecture that I mentioned, right? So it implies many other important theorems. So there's also something called the Catalan conjecture. It is implied by the ABC conjecture. So far, all we have is the proof that if the ABC conjecture is true, then the Catalan conjecture is also true. And a lot of mathematics is like that, right? So that's why I mean I think it's important to emphasize how important it is to be able to do this kind of reasoning, even if at some in many circumstances maybe you don't need to do it. As for your second question, I think that's philosophically very interesting. And my supervisor, my PhD supervisor back in the day, Göran Sundholm, has thought a lot about these things, right? I mean, what is it? Is it a supposition? Is it right? Because it's not a judgment, right? When you start with something without endorsing, it's not really a judgment. You're not, although of course Vrije said that. Vrije disagrees, right? Vrije thinks you can always start with something that is not only true, but also known to you to be true, right? But page of Vrije, right? Putting Vrije to the side, there's this what does that even mean? And as you mentioned yourself, especially reduction absurda arguments, this question immediately emerges. What exactly is happening there at the beginning? What does that mean that you're entertaining? I'm assuming for the sake of the argument, and students find it really hard, right, to learn to reason with a reduction proof, because they're so I'm supposed to assume something only to go on to show that it's false. That seems schizophrenic almost, right? I mean, I'm doing two things that are in tension with one another. So I don't have a good answer to you. I'm just gonna, agree with you that this is a really interesting and important question. What does it mean what kind of mental act is it when you start with some premises without necessarily endorsing them doxastically and then reasoning to see what follows from them? What's happening there at the beginning? I don't have an answer. I mean, I guess you need more philosophy of mind to address this question than I have included in the book.
Okay, thank you very much.
I myself have a question, and I wait for if there is any other question. I would like to ask you. Axel is pointing me somewhere. I'm not.
Es que Alejandra Olivas Dávila dijo que no podía levantar la mano y en el chat desde hace rato.
Gracias por llamarme la atención. Por favor, Alejandra. Sorry. Let me check the chat.
That's fine. Ángel, si quieres tú preguntar primero, no hay problema.
No, por favor, Alejandra.
Okay. Hi, Catarina. Thank you so much for your talk. I think I've learned a lot and remembered a lot. So I guess I have a question along the lines of what has been questioned prior to me. So how do you think that this approach, like if we include or if we take in a more serious way the dialogical approach to deduction, how would it be distinct from abduction, like properly?
Yeah. Like, so I speaking of abduction, I thought Atosha was present, but not anymore. Is that right? I'm sorry. I'll get to your point, but yeah, because of course abduction is a Mexican specialty, right? So I don't know if you work with Atosha or if you're influenced by her. I don't know. Anyway, but yeah, so that's a very interesting and important question, and it kind of connects to something that I think Axel brought up before, like what a lot of what I say seems to apply to arguments in general. Right, not only to deduction. So I think abduction is interesting because abduction is also very dialogical, right? Because it's really at least if you understand it as something along the lines of inference to the best explanation. Although some people question that, right? Say that abduction in per se is not exactly that. But anyway, putting that aside. So if it really is something that has to do with explanation, then of course you're presupposing some sort of multi-agent situation where somebody's explaining something to somebody else, right? So in that sense, there will be a lot more commonalities between abduction and deduction, right? Usually people go, deduction is here, induction and abduction are there, because deduction has necessary truth preservation and the other two don't, right? That's kind of standard classification. What I'm saying is, like, if you look at it from a dialogical perspective, then that's not the distribution you get. You get deduction and abduction on one side and induction on the other side, in the sense that induction is less, at least, induction, of course, the problem of induction is a huge thing as well. So I don't want to, be too quick here, but it does seem to me that we can say that induction is something that's less clearly connected to dialogical practices, right? It has to do with kind of perceiving statistical inferences or frequencies around us, right? So it has to do with regularities, picking up regularities, which is something we're doing all the time, apart from engaging in dialogical practices or whatever, or social practices for that matter, right? So it's this whole framework of predictive coding, right? That's very popular. I mean, now a little less, but so Andy Clark has written on that and a bunch of other people, that ultimately we're always picking up on statistical frequencies around us. So if that's what induction is, then it's not something that's so closely related to social and dialogical practices. Whereas abduction would be, right? Because it would be something that is more closely connected to explanation. And so I think that explanation makes most sense if you think about it from a multi-agent perspective.
Right.
So does that address your
It
question?
does, but I still have my concerns, right? It's like the beauty of deduction, that it's kind of isolated and that one thing takes you to another. But I think I have to think this a little bit more. But I did make another connection, and you might speak of this in the book. But I was thinking about the Phaedrus, Plato's dialogue, and how he favors oral word on top of written word, because the written word is death, it's static.
Yeah.
Whereas the oral type of word is the only one that leads towards truth, because it helps you to weed out the good arguments and the bad arguments. So throughout the whole thing, I was thinking, wow, is it is this what Plato means, sort of? But also I was thinking maybe this is just the root of reasoning itself, not so much deduction, but reasoning as a whole.
Yeah, and that's really very much what Mercier and Sperber say also, right? All of reasoning, but they think reasoning has to do with giving reasons, okay, specifically. So they don't count, say, kind of like when I catch a ball, it's thrown to me, they don't count this as a reasoning, okay? So just to clarify, so they say, right, all of giving reason, everything that involves giving reasons, if you understand reasoning in this sense, then they claim it really is best understood from a dialogical perspective, right? And I'm with them on this, right? Where I'm not with them is the evolutionary story that they have, the details of their evolutionary story. So yes, this is, reasoning thus understood, but then you might want to say that induction, some of it at least, is not really reasoning because it doesn't involve reasons, but it's instinctive and like it's picking up on statistical frequencies, okay? But other than that, yes, very much this thought that, and I talk about this in the book, not so much with respect to the Phaedron, but all the Platonic dialogues where there's this idea that the best way to, well, perhaps not the best way, but a very good way to achieve knowledge is to have these quick back and forth of like questions and answers. That it's to be preferred over long speeches also, by the way, because it's the interactive part of it that really helps you bring out, the good ideas, right? And if thinking, again, Plato, you're thinking theory of recollection, thinking like, you already know these things, you just need to be reminded of them. They need to come to the surface. Well, and then Socrates talks about him being a midwife, right, who helps people give birth to the knowledge they actually already have. So all this really requires this interactive framework, and with written words, you don't have this. At least that's the story there, right? I think this can be qualified in many different ways, but at least that's what I think kind of one way to make sense of this idea and how it fits with the rest of the things I'm saying in the book. So I hope it helps.
Saul Sarabia.
Thank you, Catarina. It's so nice to finally meet you.
Exactly.
I was supposed to be with you by now.
I know. But yes.
Coronavirus.
Who knows? Maybe.
Yeah, my question is maybe soon. Yeah. I'm very interested on evolutionary origins on reasoning. Mm-hmm. And it's very related in what you were saying. You say that we have to understand reasoning in terms of, or as embedded in social practices, right? Mm-hmm. But for example, in Mercier and Sperber, and I think as well in Cecilia Hayes' cognitive mechanisms or cognitive gadgets, they are like using something like some people have called methodological individualism, where you have to explain the social cognition in terms of what happens in the mind.
Yeah.
Right? So my question is, what will change if you take into account, for example, niche construction theory or these theories of distributed language and that kind of stuff that speaks of reasoning more in terms of bodily actions as well?
Yes, I'm much more sympathetic to this second framework that as you were describing it. So it's true, both Celia Hayes and Mercier and Sperber, in a sense, they're kind of old-fashioned cognitive scientists in the sense they're still thinking about it in terms of like, these computations, right, in the mind and all that. Whereas, of course, there are other models of thinking about cognition that take into account niche construction and the environment and the social. So I already mentioned, of course, Vygotsky, who's a big inspiration for many of these people also, by the way. But then you have like from the Gibsonian tradition, right? People looking more at like from the enactivist tradition, people looking at also the environment, right? How you connect with the environment. So I'm much more sympathetic to the second way of thinking about these questions. And I think that's also why maybe you noticed I use the term scaffolding, at some point, right? So I use the term dialogical scaffolding because I'm really interested.
Enculturation, for example, as well.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm also in my previous book, I drew a lot from the work of Richard Menari, right? So he's still quite very. I mean, we're both fans of Vygotsky, so we're very much in that ballpark, right? While also some people, some people kind of in these debates think that even I am too much of an internalist, because I do have the concept of internalization that I borrow from Vygotsky. And so I know, for example, that Dan Hutto and Eric Mine, they don't like this concept. They're like, we don't like this idea of internalization, right? So they go even like a step further, where they really want to say, like, let's not look at what happens in the inner realm at all. And for me, that's going a step too far. But certainly my perspective is very much more aligned with, say, niche construction and enculturation and all that, both in terms of environment, right? So interactions with the environment, and also the social aspects that I think are much better. And niche construction has both, right? And also this model, the apprenticeship model, for example, that Kim Sterelny has developed, is, I think, very nice because it has both the social part that you're learning from others and the environmental part, right? That you need to be in a space that facilitates the learning. So I don't know if that's also the one you're more sympathetic to, but I agree with you that Hayes and
I'm working on that.
Yeah. So Hayes and Sperber are in this sense still very traditional and very kind of inward looking.
Mariela Aguilera.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Please.
Hi, Catarina. Thanks a lot for your presentation. It was very interesting. Do you listen to me? Yeah, it's okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I have a question regarding the hypothesis of this dialogical roots of reasoning. When you talk about dialogical roots of reasoning, you're pointing to a social dimension, but also to a linguistic dimension. So I wonder if you have considered another sort of means that can play a role in reasoning, for instance, gestures, images, or that kind of artifact.
So certainly, if you look at, for example, mathematics, right, and ancient Greek mathematics, then the diagrams are extremely important. Yeah. And here too, you can adopt a kind of extended cognition perspective, right? Is to say that, well, these external devices, it's actually stuff that I worked on in my previous book. You really need. No, it's fine. I mean, these external devices, these diagrams, are an integral part of the argument, right? Because otherwise, you really need to do, like, if you're going through an Euclidean proof, you really need to go and build the diagram yourself, because that's what's going to give you the cognitive boost, and you're going to go, now I get it, right? So certainly for visual elements like diagrams and all this, totally part of the story. But another interesting conjecture is whether there can be argumentation even in pre-verbal contexts. And there's this paper by a guy called Andy Norman, which was published a few years ago, and where he describes this hypothetical situation where you might think of hominids that aren't verbal, but are already arguing or proto-arguing by, for example, pointing at, steps, right? So they're trying to, hunt the bison, and then they show that one of them can point at the traces of the bison, and it's conjectural, of course, right? It's not, obviously we don't have any evidence for anything like this happening, but so that at least, to entertain the possibility that there can even be argumentation that is not essentially, that is not fundamentally linguistic in our sense of linguistic, right? Of like with words and speaking and speech and all that. So that's definitely, it's definitely, I guess, interesting to keep that in mind as a possibility. But in practice, I think that the expressive power of such communicative systems will be very limited. And so there isn't that much argumentation that will really happen, right? Other than, pointing and all that. But maybe you can speak of argumentation that doesn't involve language at all. Might be.
Thank you. I'm going to look your other book.
Yes, my other book was more about the stuff on notations and how notations and diagrams, they, are involved in reasoning. So, yeah.
Nicolás Serrano.
Hi, Catarina. Thank you for your talk. So I have kind of a clarificatory question, which I think is rather external. So I hope it makes sense, the question in itself. And it has to do with what is the metaphysical status? I mean, what are the metaphysical consequences of what you're proposing? Because I took note that you said that you're not a social constructivist all the way, yet it seems like I guess one way to frame it is, what is it that is that uses the social scaffolding? Is it deductive reasoning in itself, or is it like discourse about deductive reasoning or deductive practices or something like that?
Yeah, so practices, right? Because first of all, I mean, generally I don't do metaphysics. I'm kind of unable to do metaphysics. I mean, I'd say this as a joke. I do social ontology, for example. This is something that I like. In fact, one of my postdocs works on social ontology. So that I like, if you think about like, what's the kind of the ontological status of something like a university, right? Or money. Mm-hmm. And so I think these are interesting questions. And my ontological, I guess the closest that I get to an ontological position would be kind of what Amy Thomason calls like easy ontology. I don't know if you're familiar with that, right? Which is like that you just kind of, you're not making like, thick statements about things really existing, right? It's just, ontology is just a way, it's just like, concepts you introduce to organize experiences, and right. So this is just an introduction, right? I haven't started answering your question. So just to say that I'm always very, very careful in making metaphysical claims, and but as to the question. So for me, my ontologies is really its practices, right? I mean, what's really grounding everything, it's just like things that people are doing, right? And then it's all bottom up from there. That's why I said that the last chapter where I talk about actual mathematical practices is absolutely essential for the whole book, right? Because it's practice. I'm a pragmatist in this sense, right? It's really practices, and then from there there's stuff. But this is the rock bottom. This is what grounds everything. It's actual practices. And if nobody did anything that looked like practices of deduction, then my whole book would be about error. Right, because I don't, because people actually do deduction in some circles at least, then it's that there's an ontological basis for me to be saying, to be investigating these phenomena, right? So I'm really a few months ago there was a workshop on the book organized by people in Canada, and one of the participants was Bob Brandom. And he also wrote the endorsement of the book, and I'm very happy about that. And but he says, you're more of a pragmatist than I am, he said to me. I'm like, yeah, pretty much, yeah. Okay. So I don't know if this helps, right?
That answers the question perfectly. Yeah. Thank you.
And Raimundo.
Thank you, Catarina. One of the things that I like most about your book is that you distance yourself from the tradition of a polemic idea of dialectics. That in the tradition is always a fight to the death, zero-sum game.
Right,
and
exactly.
You say, let's go to a semi-adversarial model. Let's not consider that the other person is trying to destroy you. They're actually cooperating in a certain way. Yeah. But your model still has the other person, you call it the skeptic, trying to block the conclusion.
No, not trying to block, right? That's the whole point. But anyway, go on, please. Let's.
Well, actually, in page 31, you say the skeptic wants to block the establishment of the conclusion.
Where? Because I changed my mind. So I think I've said that the skeptic wants to block the conclusion in earlier papers, and I moved more and more away from this idea. So it might be that it's still, slipped somewhere, right? But because this really is something that there was a big change in my thinking about these things, right? So what you're describing is very much actually my trajectory. I started thinking about it very much, still with kind of like the Lawrence and Hintica way of thinking about it, that it's really adversarial and it's really like a zero-sum game and the participants have opposite goals and only one's going to win. I really started thinking about these dialogues in this way. And then I moved more and more away from this way of thinking, right? So in the end, my current position is that so I do say this in one of the chapters, that it's a mixed dialogue in that prover does have a purpose, a goal, right? Prover does want to establish the conclusion, but skeptic is kind of indifferent, right? As to whether the conclusion will be established or not. Skeptic is just not going to be, not going to let prover off the hook easily, right? But skeptic doesn't have as his mission to block the conclusion, right? No matter what, not at all. If anything, skeptic has as a mission, as it were, to help prover come up with a good proof, right? If you think about what a referee does, right? Of course, there are nasty referees. We know that, in particular in philosophy, perhaps, but actually mathematics less so. And it's usually expected, right? It's like that. It's really about helping. Skeptic is asking questions to help prover come up with a good proof, or if not, to discover that the proof is not a viable one, right? So that's why there's much, much more cooperation. So there's a very small misalignment of interests, right? Because prover does have like a goal, and skeptic is kind of indifferent either way, okay? So I've actually,
I like very much your idea of the referee. It maybe move from a model in which the referee is a skeptic, putting tests and checking, to more like a model of quality control.
Yeah.
I want you to reach the conclusion.
Please.
Sorry?
Pardon, sorry, Sebastian?
2 more questions we have and only 4 minutes. So.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, we can talk more, Raymond, if you want. We can email or whatever, because this is a point that I'm very interested in. So thank you for your question.
Erika Torres.
Yeah. So, hi, Catarina. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your presentation. It was very clear. And I would like to go back to a claim that you made before, which is regarding the roots of deduction. Social goes first. So it is, so what? Yeah, but I would like to know if you could say something more in terms of cognitive development, how you understand that social, they are social interactions mechanisms in terms of cognitive mechanisms, or social practices are kind of inputs to cognitive mechanisms to develop those tools needed to deduction.
So the story is that really the social practices, they really allow you to even develop certain cognitive capacities. And in a sense, that's not even a controversial claim. It's just weird that a lot of cognitive science doesn't seem to take that into account, right? So it's well known, if those extremely tragic stories of kids that are locked up until age 12 and nobody talks to them, they don't develop language, and they don't develop all kinds of cognitive skills, right? So the story really is that, our starter kit, genetically speaking, there's a lot of potential there, but it needs to be actualized these interactions really happening, right? And in fact, now, just to extrapolate a bit, there's all this worry about, kids who are, attending school online, and, how much of a problem is this going to be? And I think it's a legitimate question, because it follows from my model, at least, that the interaction is extremely important, right? The kids don't learn just from watching TV. They really need to be talking to people. So the thought is really that, of course, there's already something there that allows for these, that gives the potential for these social processes to happen. And there's variation, right? Of course, that people who are neurotypical, people who are not neurotypical will develop in different ways, right? So of course, genetics makes a difference. Of course, your starting point is it's not completely open. But then once, that given your starting point, you really need these social practices for these abilities to develop, to mature. So that's kind of the story. I don't know if that was your question, or maybe I didn't understand it.
No, that's okay. It's perfectly okay. Thank you so much.
Because there's one more question, right? So I think that was.
I can ask you extremely quickly, because we're running out of time, and we.
Well, the takeout delivery hasn't arrived yet, so.
So just one question. I want to know a little bit more about this process of internalization, with how metaphorical it is, and how you interpret the evidence. Yeah. So if the deduction that we do is dialectical, because we have this internal this internal skeptic inside of us.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It sounds weird to me that you use the evidence showing that we reason better in groups, because all deduction, even the one that we do very bad, is dialectical. So I'm a little bit puzzled. Is it that when I discuss with you, you're a better skeptic than my own skeptic, or what is supposed to be the how is it supposed to work?
Yeah,
if it's supposed to be evidence in favor of.
So you said it was a simple question. This is not a simple question, but it's a great question. I'm not just, but anyway, sorry for the bad joke. But yeah, no. So first of all, on the Vygotskian notion of internalization, there's quite some discussion about whether it's not too metaphorical, hand wavy, and stuff. So that's definitely there's a good point there. There's a good systematic point that needs to be addressed there. So one evidence that I use that I refer to in the book is actually the phenomenology that mathematicians describe of how they come up with proofs, right? They say that, I've heard this from many people, I didn't do this kind of rigorously, but it could be done, that they go they start with the hat of prover, they start kind of trying to prove something, and when it's kind of getting difficult and they don't know getting out of it, then they switch hats, as it were, and they start looking for, okay, why is this not going through? What's the problem? Where is the problem there, right? So one piece of evidence that I offer is this description of the phenomenology of proof. But of course, here we're talking about people who are already trained as mathematicians, right? So this is already the product of extensive training. These are professional mathematicians, right? And so they've been trained to be able to switch hats, as it were, between being the skeptic and the prover. But for those of us who don't have this training, then actually, I kind of was trained as a logician, so I have a little bit, I guess. Well, I also studied math, but anyway, the point is that it does require a lot of training, right? This internalization process doesn't happen it takes a lot of practice, and so I don't know. I mean, if that. And that's why only it's almost always better to be, and even remember the example that I gave of Hermesless Theorem, it was other people who found the mistake in the proof in Wallas's proof, whereas Wallas is a brilliant mathematician, right? But of course he was playing, he had the skeptic in his head as well, but it's only when he submitted the proof and then to the scrutiny of actual skeptics, real life flesh and blood skeptics, they found a mistake that he himself had not found. So that's another point that I make also in final chapter, how important like the social way of also thinking about mathematics, you really need to think about it as a social epistemic practice. But people are collaborating with each other in this way all the time. I don't know. How does that help a bit?
Yeah,
it was a difficult question.
I want to read more about that, but that was definitely helpful. Thank you very much.
Okay.
So I'm gonna just unmute everyone to just thank you very much for being here, for presenting your work, and for the discussions. Thanks to all the participants for being here in the discussion, and I'll see you within a month with our last prepare session. I will email you to see how the interest of people in continuing with this activity is and move on. But for now, thank you very much, Catarina.
Thank you all. And I hope, if people want to discuss further things, let me just make a very quick comment. I see there are some comments here about metaphors for argumentation and stuff. Of course, I'm still working on argumentation, right? But now not on deductive argumentation. So some of my recent work addresses a lot of these questions. So if you're interested, you can go check it out. But yeah, so it's not just what I've done in the book. I'm still thinking about adversariality and cooperation in argumentation, for example. So hit me up if you want to know more, and I'll send you some pointers. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.